Thank you, Mr. President. Point of personal privilege.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I was not going to mention this, but because there have been comments on it, I will respond. It has been 40 years since the fateful decision in Roe versus Wade, a day upon which many people in the pro-life community believe that the Supreme Court departed from its role as the interpreter of the law and became a separate legislative branch of its own. When I hear discussions about this, I hear very mild comments about choice and reproductive rights and things of this sort. But I recall back in the days of Nazi Germany, there was a place called Auschwitz, and over the gates of Auschwitz was a sign, and the sign said, "Arbeit macht frei," which means roughly, your labors will make you free. But the people who went behind those doors never returned. Their labors didn't make them free. And I'm reminded that we refer to our clinics as women's health clinics, and we talk about reproductive rights and so forth. And somehow in all of our discussion, we forget the fact that in each of these decisions lies the life of a little boy or a little girl. You know, it was quite easy, and we, from where we look back on history, we say, why didn't the Germans do something? Why didn't they rise up? Why didn't they take action? But they were helpless before their government, just as we are helpless before our government. And beyond that, the things that were taking place, the horrors that took place were taking place behind closed doors. And when I think about abortion, my mind returns to battlefields in Vietnam. And I recall one day when we approached the enemy lines and suddenly an 8-inch artillery shell with white phosphorus came whistling into our ranks, and it exploded in our midst. I was terrified. I tried to run from the flaming phosphorus, and by the time I had turned around, I could see up ahead of me the flames were falling up beyond me, and I just stood there and listened to the phosphorus tinkling on my flak vest and on my helmet. Well, they were harmless enough for me, but the shell had exploded right next to another Marine, and he was horribly burned. And I rushed with a group of others, and we desperately tried to do what we could for him. And his eyes were burned out, and his flesh was burned off. And he lay there, and he shook with pain and with horror and with blindness. And we desperately rushed him to a helicopter. And I will tell you that later that night, when we heard that he had died, there was almost a sense of relief that he was released from the terrible pain and suffering. And I recall another time when we were being forced back by a much larger enemy force, and in the midst of the battle, there was an enemy soldier who was concealed, hidden in what we called a spider hole. And he emerged from the spider hole, and he threw a grenade in the midst of the Marines, and it exploded. And across the field of battle, from about where I am to the senior senator from Loudoun, another Marine seized him and grabbed him from the spider hole, pulled out a bayonet, and began to slash him with it. And I remember this enemy soldier, this Viet Cong soldier, screaming with desperation, screaming like an animal. And all that I could do as the enemy were surging around us was to yell across the field and say, "Shoot him. For God's sake, just shoot him." And they did. And as we ran by, I recall looking at him, and he was clearly dead. No one would doubt that he was dead, and yet his body shook with the adrenaline that had surged from the horror and the terror that he had just gone through. Ladies and gentlemen, the children who die in the womb don't die easily. People do not die easily. People die in a desperate struggle for life. And it is no different from that little boy or that little girl in the womb than it is for you and I when we struggle for life. I know the horror that these children are put through, and I know the pain and the suffering that they're exposed to in the womb. Years ago, I introduced a bill that would have required anesthetizing the child so that they would not at least be exposed to this suffering during their death. But the abortion industry opposed it. We mustn't in any way suggest that the little boy or the little girl is a child, is something more than a blob of tissue. So, ladies and gentlemen, on this grand and glorious day of the 40th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, an anniversary which marks the beginning of the death of 55 million Americans, I don't look at it as a choice. I look at it as a time of terror and of suffering for each of these children. And so I thank you for allowing me to impose on your time.
Thank you, Senator. A senator from James City County, Senator Norman.
Mr. President, I rise on a point of personal privilege.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I've listened with intent interest both on the comments as it related to the process that took place yesterday as well as the discussion on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade.